We'll fix it in post.
Love it.
Books. Books. Books.
Hello, and welcome to Didn't Read It, the podcast that forgot to read the book before arguing about it with strangers on the internet. I am your host, Grace Todd, a writer, editor, and book gremlin. And with me today is my good friend and fellow book gremlin, Ty Phelps. Ty, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks for being here.
I'm a writer. I'm a teacher. I'm a musician. I've been teaching English creative writing at VCU and Randolph-Macon College this semester. And we're going to talk about one of my very favorite authors today, so I'm pretty excited.
I am excited too. And I will say, a slight aberration from the norm, I have read what we are discussing, but I haven't read it in a really long time. However, what I have seen is people invoking it on the internet constantly. I'm calling this Didn't Read It's first ever Twitter post special.
I love it.
Because as you know, Ty, and as the listeners are about to find out, not only has everyone been arguing about this book or the story on Twitter nonstop for the last year, but I have been dutifully screen capping the absolute worst takes that the internet has to offer and sending them to you because misery loves company.
It warms my bitter Midwestern heart because I am not on Twitter. And so I appreciate you helping me stay abreast of the discourse.
I'm trying to keep you hip, man.
I appreciate it.
So with all of that...
I really need all the help I can get.
You really do. So with all of that, what are we discussing today?
Today we are talking about the Ursula Le Guin short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. This is maybe her most famous short story. I do not believe it's her most famous work. I would say that's probably The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed, two novels in the Hainish cycle, or her Earthsea books. But this is the short story that your English teacher may have made you read when you were a junior in high school, for example. And it's a story that has a fair amount of lasting influence. So, yeah, I think it's maybe her most well-known short story. All
right. So I start by asking people what they already know about a work. So I guess I'm just going to butt in here and volunteer what I already know about the work, which
Please
is
do.
I read it a long time ago. I remember sort of the tragic hinging detail in broad strokes. I was probably assigned it in high school, I want to say, and I'm broadly familiar with Ursula K. Le Guin. I think I read the Earthsea books maybe in high school.
I love the Earthsea books.
I remember loving them. It's been a long time, though. There are a lot of novels between now and then, and so they get a little muddied up with some of the other similar...
If you ever need to borrow some, I have almost everything in sometimes some pretty big, beautiful volumes. So just so you know.
BBVs?
BBVs, big, beautiful volumes.
I love a big, beautiful volume.
Who doesn't?
Bow, 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 bow.
They just look so juicy up on the shelves.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, that's enough.
So basically, I am aware that this is a dystopian short story. I am, as we discussed, aware that it pops up on Twitter all the time. And I am aware that every single poster on the internet has a different idea of how to interpret it.
It is a interpretable story, and we're going to wade into what we think of the interpretations kind of right away, because I know you normally start with like a summary of the work in question, but this story doesn't really have a plot. It's also pretty short, so you're going to get like a 2-minute summary of the plot, which I'm happy to dive into whenever you'd like.
That is fine. Why don't we go ahead and summarize away?
So the story begins with basically a setting description, just a big slew of details, a clamor of bells, swallows soaring. Basically, the festival of summer is happening in the city of Omelas. And there is a narrator telling us about this and explaining how Omelas is this wonderful place, joyous. There's just enough wind to make the banners snap and flutter. The folk are described as simple but happy. They are not, however, barbarians. There are no kings. The laws are few and just. This is basically a description of a big celebration, and this goes on for quite a number of pages And the interesting thing about it is it also appears as if the narrator is sort of speaking this world into existence, right? There's beautiful naked people wandering about. There's religion, but there's no clergy. The narrator says at one point, "I thought at first there were no drugs, but that is puritanical. For those who like it, the faint insistent sweetness of druze may perfume the ways of the city. Druze with first brings a great lightness and brilliance to the mind and limbs, and then after some hours a dreamy languor." Right? So like
summer festivals, nudity, drugs. I'm
Right.
on board. This sounds great.
Oh, yeah, no,
Take me to there.
it is a, it's supposed to be an incredibly joyous, beautiful place.
Surely there could be no downside.
Right. Now, there's no twist coming. There's no pivot. It's just a nice description of nice things. There's a child who plays a flute, and this is quite interesting. And then the narrator asks the reader, "Do you believe? Do you accept the festival, the city, the joy?" No? Then let me describe one more thing. And then the narrator describes a child locked in a basement.
No, not a twist.
A twist. This is the twist. The child is locked in the basement. The child is severely mentally challenged. The child is suffering and miserable and lying in its own filth and gets fed little scraps here and there. And everyone knows about the child. Everyone goes and sees the child. Other children are told about the existence of the child, usually when they were 9 or 10, somewhere in there. And then the narrator tells us that the child's suffering is the necessary component for all the joy. That without the child suffering, there can be none of the other stuff. These are the conditions, and those conditions cannot be messed with. You cannot rescue the child. It is outside the bounds that the narrator has created by speaking this story into existence. We then learn that after the narrator asks us again, "Now do you believe in them? Are they not more credible?" And then the narrator turns and says again, well, some people go see the child, or after many years of living in the city of Omelas, suddenly they decide that they're going to leave, and they walk away. And they always leave singly. They always leave individually. There is not like a big, wild exodus. And they don't know where they're walking to. The narrator says that the place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than this city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist. And so the story ends with this sort of general stream of people slowly walking away towards something. And that's it. It's a description of a joyous city, and then a description of a horribly suffering child. Mm-hmm. And then there's a choice: stay in the city or leave the city, but neither of those things actually help the child. And that's the story.
Yay.
Yay.
Cheerful.
It's a cheerful,
heartwarming,
wonderful story. It's a great bedtime story for the wee ones.
Yeah. I'm going to go find a toddler.
Read it to your 7-year-old.
I'm going to read it. No, younger than that. I want to make sure that they have a hard time parsing through the difference between fact and fiction.
Oh, great.
I want to give them a complex nice and early.
Okay, so maybe 4?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
3 or 4?
Yeah, good
sure.
and young.
Yeah.
Whiskey break.
This is a whiskey break.
Although, and I know we're going to get to this, but we are all both the ones in Omelas, the ones walking away from Omelas, and many of us are the child.
Right. Yes. It's an easy one to summarize because nothing really happens.
Because it's 5 pages long.
It's 5 pages of mostly description.
Which is not common in storytelling. It's a bold move storytelling-wise.
It is really an interesting structure. One of the things that is so fascinating about this story is it really does seem to be, and I think most really good science fiction is some kind of thought exercise. What happens if we take this element of humanity away and we pull that thread and see what happens? Or what happens if this kind of technology exists? Okay, well, what are some potential complications in that? And so, but this one really sort of functions. There's no real narrative arc other than the child. There's not a single character that we follow, and the child doesn't have a name, and the child doesn't change, right? So it is really fiction as thought experiment more than anything else.
I mean, it is essentially a trolley problem more than it's really a story.
That is an excellent analogy. Because the trolley problem also does not have a good answer.
No, there's no real solution.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the last time I saw this invoked on Twitter, which was in the last 48 hours, was a guy who was trying to make a really, really bizarre utilitarian ethics argument about rape, which amounted to this is so horrifying that it's horrifying enough that I might have to cut it. The utilitarian ethics problem that he was outlining was if 3 men are suicidal because they are virgins and they rape one woman and they cease to be suicidal, but the woman kills herself, does that math out?
That's some fucked up repugnant shit.
It is some of the worst things. It's some of the worst shit I've seen in a long time. And a bunch of people in the comments were invoking this story. And they were invoking the story to tell him he was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that the thought exercise itself was wrong and not worth engaging with, which I think is not unfair, right? I mean, a thing I wonder sometimes if thought experiments, like ethics thought experiments broadly, are more useful as a means of convincing people never to do anything than they are of getting people to probe their own beliefs.
Right. I think that's the danger of it. And that's certainly the interpretation, right? One of the kind of sorts of interpretations that this story can lead one toward, which I think ignores some of the subtleties and nuances of the story, right? The choices neither choice presented here may solve the problem of the child, but the choices are not exactly the same.
Yeah, so having not read it, again, even though it's quite short, and I know that there is not... A thing I find interesting about it, based on the way that you're describing it, is how few threads there are for the reader to grab onto in terms of, especially with, I think, science fiction and fantasy broadly, and not in a bad way, tend to invite a certain amount of, and what would you do, reader? Like, how would you, I think that is one of the things that makes these genres in particular so worthwhile. And horror too, actually, now that I say it. Mm-hmm. It really invites that kind of, well, how, is this the right way to handle it? Is this the wrong way to handle it? What does it mean if you choose to handle it this way? And this story seems to offer very little of that, which perhaps is why people react to it in such different ways.
Yes, and I think, right, there's a binary choice presented. And so it's very easy to think about, well, what would I do? Which choice would I make? And this is also why this is such a fun story to teach, because it gets students all riled up about morals and ethics and philosophy. But as soon as they decide what like the right choice is, you can very easily complicate and puncture that as the teacher, and then they're just sort of stuck wondering, which is a great place to make your students wind up. But you said earlier, we're both all walking away from Omelas. We're all staying in Omelas. And we are, many of us, the child. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that it's not necessarily a binary choice, even though the story presents it as such. We participate in capitalism, right? Which necessitates, through its structures, exploitation. And so if we wear clothing, chances are children suffered for it.
I mean, yeah, there's really no way around this.
Right? And sure, we can go off individually perhaps and grow our own fabric-producing plants and make our own, but that's not a solution that is really scalable in a significant way.
Also, like I have said it before, I will say it again, this is a huge pet peeve of mine. Like, unless you are very, very rich, at which point you are already benefiting from the system, so why opt out of it? You are not going to be able to move to the woods and exist separately from society. It cannot be done. You can't. You listening, you there, you can't do it. It won't work. Mm-hmm. Unless you have a penicillin tree, it's not happening.
And like own land, which already makes you someone of at least reasonable means. Yeah. So the idea that opting out, and I get in this argument about people with voting sometimes, like, oh, I'm not going to vote. Well, like, okay, you're just making it easier for everyone else who does vote to make the choices for you.
But also, like, voting...
I mean, and voting is not the answer to what ails society. but not doing it doesn't actually do anything of value either.
The ones who vote for centrists in Omelas.
Right. Yeah. The centrists in Omelas.
They're not leaving. They're
No.
not staying. They're standing right at the edge and talking a lot about leaving.
They're in Omelas' suburbs.
Now, do you require, does every suburb necessitate like a separate child? Like, what is the
I think suburbs feed off their city centers. I think the suburbs are all just, it's not until you get to the next city that there's another child. This is a horrifying tangent.
What is the physical range of a suffering child? Like, are we talking 100 miles, 50 miles? Or is it one child per civilization, one child per city state?
I think it's the latter. Yeah.
Per city. So is the countryside dotted with other city states? Okay. Follow-up question. Are there other city states full of people who are suffering and Omelas is refusing to let them in on the secret of the basement child?
Ooh. I mean, what? Now we're into immigration.
Yeah, like what is the diplomatic solution to the Omelas situation? Do you tell your allies?
I think this is why. So what's interesting, Le Guin's science fiction is loosely linked in a series of novels and stories called the Hainish Cycle. And that's where The Dispossessed and The Left Hand of Darkness and some of her best-known science fiction works all live. And Omelas doesn't seem to actually exist as a place in that system the way a lot of the other planets and, systems do. And so it functions purely as sort of symbolic experiment, even though she connects it very specifically to another story in some of the metatext in her collection, The Wind's 12 Quarters, which is where this story was first published as in a collection.
Yeah, actually, to take a quick tangent, when was this published?
This was published in 1974. It won the Hugo Award for Best Short Story that year. So this is at this point, going on 50.
It's fascinating to me to think that this was written, and I understand that this is a very Western-centric, specifically United States-centric perspective, because obviously things were real bad in the 70s in a lot of ways in a lot of places, and were terrible in the 70s here for a lot of people. But very specifically, so the 70s sucked, right, for a lot of people, tons of people. It was a bad time. But one of the parallels that I see invoked with this story a lot that you brought up yourself, right? It's where I think one of the places that people jump to first in 2023 is essentially sweatshop labor and manufacturing conditions, which wasn't a thing as much yet in the 70s. I don't think we had lots of children suffering in other ways, but the, shall we say, formalization and institutionalization of child suffering in the 70s, do you think that would have felt like looking backwards in a way to do you think she was drawing on not just contemporary, I guess what I'm saying is, when she was writing it, do you feel like she is looking back, drawing on things like children in factories and that kind of thing in a previous era, and she's projecting forward? Do you think she's thinking more specifically of children who are suffering in wars contemporarily in the 70s? What do you think the historical context of this was for Le Guin?
I think it's both those things. I also think it might be useful to bring in a couple of the other pieces that I think have real thematic resonance with this story that she was writing right around the same time, because I think the other part of it is that she chose a child for this because the suffering child is the most evocative image of the cost of, the joy and the rest of it, right? That
we do love a suffering child.
Yeah. So I think
children and dogs.
Right. So she was probably certainly considering, pre-child labor laws and things like that, and the exploitation of kids around the world, and all that. No doubt all that was kind of floating around. But she was also, I think she was trying to explore this idea of what is the best kind of society. And when she wrote The Dispossessed is subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia. And The Dispossessed is...
It's a fantastic subtitle.
It is a fantastic subtitle. It's a fantastic novel. And in this novel, for those of you that are unfamiliar, it's basically one of the only science fiction novels, or novels of any kind that really explores an anarchist society. And so what happens is 100 years before the events of the novel, there is an anarchist revolution on a planet called Urus. And the revolution goes so powerfully that the governments of Urus, in order to get rid of the anarchists, basically say, you can go colonize the moon. And they move up to the moon, Anaris, and they build a anarchist society there.
Anarchy moon, anarchy moon.
It's an anarchy
Gonna
moon.
build an anarchy moon.
And this society exists for a number of decades. And then finally, a physicist named Shevek, who's achieving things in physics that like no one else has been able to accomplish, is invited back to Urus. And he is the first denizen of the moon, Anaris, to go back to the home planet in multiple hundreds of years. And we see, or maybe just 100, a while. And so we see his journey, his backstory in part of the book, and also his complicated journey on the home planet, and the way he's treated very royally, and eventually him throwing off those things and going to try to find people in the streets and, stirring up some shit. And we also see the way that Anaris becomes the anarchist society starts to fall into, groupthink, for lack of a better word. And there isn't state-sanctioned power, but Shevek wants to return because he wants to go explore something, which theoretically is well within his rights as an individual in an anarchist, society. And lots of people try to prevent him.
Wait, who tries to prevent him? The people on
Anaris.
Oh, they don't want him back.
No, they don't want him to go.
Oh, they don't want him to leave. Okay.
They don't want him to go to Urus.
Okay, I understand.
Right. And so there are certain elements of the society that get very dogmatic. And so Le Guin is, I think, ultimately Anaris is presented very empathetically and beautifully, and there's a lot of really wonderful things about the culture, but it is also like a really hard world, and there is also like real costs, right? Things are given up. And so that's the ambiguous part of the ambiguous utopia.
Sure.
It's also very fragile because it is easy for what was originally a freely agreed upon code of mutual aid to become, you get a few folks that start to accumulate a little power, or you get a few groups that start to emphasize not sort of guidelines, but dogma. And these are, to some extent, natural human impulses. So anyway.
So fragile because all societies are fragile, or
Yes.
specifically fragile?
Fragile because all societies are fragile. And it is hard as ideas drift away from their origins.
Mm-hmm.
They become symbolic, which therefore can make them sort of fossilized. And so she's writing this book at around this time. She's writing a short story about the founder named Odo of the anarchist revolution on Urus. She writes the story of Odo as an old woman who is sort of living in a world she created but doesn't fit in because she grew up in the old world. And she also says in some metatext about that story called The Day Before the Revolution that she imagines Odo as one of the ones who walks away from Omelas.
Okay. And that's where it ties back in.
And this is one real quick thing that I think makes some interesting. It doesn't mean that walking away from Omelas guarantees anything that could ultimately save the child or do any real good, but staying precludes the possibility even, whereas leaving allows for an unimaginable possibility.
Yeah, and I want to dig more into, we took a good detour there, but I want to dig into the way that those decisions are differentiated and the way and what they kind of mean. And thank you especially for the context on the anarchist story, especially the anarchist moon, which is I'm very taken with this image now. I want to go live on an anarchist moon. It's really interesting to think about that as sitting kind of as a counterpoint to Omelas, right? Like happy city state, no problems, suffering child, fragile attempt at an ambiguous utopia on the moon. I can see how these are fish swimming in the same author's river, as it were. I don't know why I used that image. That's a weird image, but it's fine.
Well, and I think, right, they're very distinct, right? The suffering in Omelas is so disproportionate, whereas the suffering, the idea of the moon, the anarchist moon, is that the suffering is spread generally equitably amongst the population. We've all got to pitch in and do labor we don't want to do sometimes. We all have to go on rations when there's a problem sometimes. And so the suffering is diffuse, as is the joy, right? Whereas in Omelas, it is completely, the huge pyramid and then one suffering point at the bottom.
Right. Especially thinking about the concentrated suffering of it all, right? I feel like what I see, again, what inspired this, right, was Twitter shit posting. I feel like I see a lot of people who seem very confident that walking away from Omelas is not just the right answer, but the stupidly obvious answer, that it feels very like, walk away from Omelas, dummy. But we live in it and we can't.
We can't. And frankly, okay, walk away from Omelas. A, you can't. B, if you could, you probably wouldn't. Because, look, we like streaming content. We like deliveries. We like a grocery store that has lots of different variety of food that we can just go get any time we want. We like all that stuff, right? Modernity has a lot of perks. Selfishly, for me, I don't like giving up like music, like recorded music would be really, really difficult. That might be a deal breaker for me, which is completely selfish and awful. But like, if we actually stopped and thought and tried to actually like, so what is Omelasian about our society?
All of it.
All of it?
Like at every conceivable step from top to bottom. But I mean, we know that, right? A thing I have been working on about myself is I am trying not to preach to the choir. Doesn't even do it anymore. It's like I'm trying not to browbeat the already kneecapped. Like we know, and I apologize, dear listeners. I know you know. So I guess to reel us back a little bit, because I think you and I could shout about this for 3 hours.
Probably.
Can you talk to me about how you feel Guin feels, or the story feels, if you want to go sort of death of the author, about the people who stay? Because I don't think we pay a lot of attention to that, right? I think we all feel guilty about being the ones who stay, and I think that leads people's reactions to this story to be kind of outsized, because especially at this point in corporate feudalism, we all feel really guilty for a lot of things all the time, every day. And anything that underlines that for us, I think, leads to sort of big feelings. But I don't know. Tell me about the ones who stay.
Well, I think actually the story does not have a lot of judgment. It doesn't say anything negative about the people who stay. It celebrates them all throughout those beautiful descriptions in the beginning. It shows the beauty and joy first and suggests that beauty and joy is in many ways genuine. And it is interesting to me, too, that the story structure is this sort of direct address to the reader that seems to be extemporaneously creating the world. Like the narrator is just like sort of throwing things. Oh, let's toss an orgy in there, and let's, and there's beer, and we're not Puritans.
When in doubt, toss an orgy in.
Right? And then it is the narrators then questioning, and I think this is the other reason people have such strong reactions, is because this is a direct address to the reader, asking, do you believe in this? No? Okay. Then I will add this other part to justify it. There is a lot of stuff about, and the story has earlier stuff about, we tend to, in art, we tend to lionize despair rather than joy. We tend to focus on dark emotions because they feel more serious and more significant, but happiness is actually really important. And so I think there is some complicated stuff around the people that stay. It's not meant to be, I don't think, a tisk-tisk judgment. I think it is meant to be like, both of these choices are morally ambiguous. There are real, benefits to either. Frankly, and I think we would honestly, and I don't know if this was on Twitter or if this was somewhere else, but I think I read something that was like, look, we would take the Omelas deal 100 times out of 100. The suffering of only one child?
What a bargain.
Right? Like, so.
Yeah, no, a thing I definitely have seen on Twitter is people pointing out that Omelas is actually an improvement on the society that we live in currently.
Mm-hmm.
So
I don't, this.
Who's the dystopia now, bitch?
So the story is, here, let me read a little bit. The trouble is that we have a bad habit, encouraged by pedants and sophisticates, of considering happiness as something rather stupid. Only pain is intellectual, only evil interesting. This is the treason of the artist. A refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain. If you can't lick 'em, join 'em. If it hurts, repeat it. But to praise despair is to condemn delight. To embrace violence is to lose hold of everything else. We have almost lost hold. We can no longer describe a happy man, nor make any celebration of joy. How can I tell you about the people of Omelas? They were not naive and happy children, though their children were in fact happy. They were mature, intelligent, passionate adults whose lives were not wretched. Oh, miracle. But I wish I could describe it better. I wish I could convince you.
Okay. That's so interesting because that is the
That's the narrator.
No, I was going to say that's the offending passage that turned that one tweeter into the main character very briefly, because they decided that was the only point of this story, and that anyone who disagreed with them was clearly an idiot who had never read it. But what's so interesting to me about that is I understand that there is... Okay, hang on. So here's what this person said. I actually screen capped the tweets.
Excellent.
I am withholding the username.
Great.
To protect the accidental main character. I don't think this person wanted to be the main character, and I want to be very clear, I have nothing against them personally, but this is the first ever Twitter post special. So,
great.
Say 5 tweet thread.
Oh boy.
I know. Tweet 1. It kills me how Ursula K, in writing a story about how people refuse to engage with a narrative unless it contains suffering, inadvertently created one of the most long-lasting shorthands for dystopian society in the modern narrative. I just watched your face. Hey, that's tweet 1.
Fine, just get through all of them and then I'll respond.
Omelas isn't an ethical conundrum. It isn't a real place, even in the bounds of the story. It's about how the reader refuses to engage with the shining city until the narrator gives up and adds an element of dystopia. And now that dystopian element is all anybody talks about. 5 exclamation points. People start leaving at the end because the cultural hunger for suffering and the belief that sorrow is more interesting than joy have turned their beautiful life into a mere facade. The story sucks now, and we ruined it. Normally, I'm more than happy to let people be wrong about media, but The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a story that's very near and dear to my heart. Plus, it's incredibly obvious that none of you have read it.
Okay. First of all, there is an element of truth in the interpretation, right? There is a challenge, I think, to a reader's imagination. Why can't we imagine something that doesn't require the suffering? What is wrong with us? But at the same time, the story doesn't deliver that. And Le Guin could have written a story that really didn't have suffering, but she chose to do it this way. So, okay, I'm empathetic to that interpretation because I think there's stuff in the story that supports that. It is certainly not the only way to read the story, and it's probably not the dominant way to read the story because the moral question is that's posed, even if it is a question without a good answer, is the big takeaway. And so, like, of course people are going to fixate on that. Now, I think it's dangerous. I just dropped something. Now, it's dangerous to focus only on the story once the suffering is introduced. There's half the story before that. And so I think this guy is, whoever they are, is like kind of right, but shouldn't be lecturing people about there's lots of other interesting things about this story besides the direct address.
Ty, aren't you aware that every book and short story has exactly one interpretation and all the others are objectively wrong?
Oh, it makes me so mad.
No, what jumped out at me, though, in that excerpt you just read, especially after observing so much Omelas posting, was not the tack that this person took, or not. What jumped out at me was less that we can't imagine a world without suffering. What jumped out at me was actually the banality of evil part, which is really, that's really interesting to me, right? Because I think, yes, from that passage, I get that maybe it is concerning that we can't imagine narratives that don't involve suffering. I think it's just as interesting and just as concerning that we cannot seem to help ourselves when it comes to valorizing like in any Disney film, who is the most interesting character?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
In almost any superhero movie, who is the most interesting character?
Mm-hmm.
We find transgression fascinating
Mm-hmm.
and sexy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine when it's just transgression, but we seem to have a really hard time, especially in, I think, contemporary narrative, with drawing a line between interesting transgression and people who are struggling to understand themselves or the world that they live in, and people who are challenging or pushing back against social norms, and people whose aims are objectively horrifying and are essentially objectively harmful.
Mm-hmm.
To humanity at large. Like we have a really hard time drawing that line, and we have a hard time drawing that line in real life, never mind in fiction,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the fact of the matter is Jeff Bezos isn't interesting.
Right.
He's a boring man. He's also an objectively bad person
Mm-hmm.
because you don't get that rich by being anything else.
Right.
But he's lame. We shouldn't be paying any attention to him. We shouldn't be paying any attention to Elon Musk, who is also a boring man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you had an interesting life, you would not be on Twitter that much. That's just my 2 cents.
There's a tweet that I see not infrequently that amounts to like, rich people can have anything they want in life except for respect on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
It's all we have.
That's right. You're not going to get it.
And you can't have it.
Well, and I remember, and this is showing the rest of my nerddom. I remember in the bonus features of the Lord of the Rings movies, a Tolkien scholar talking, and dear listeners, our lovely host is giggling at me off mic.
Well, I was sitting at home the other day rewatching my Lord of the Rings bonus features.
Honestly, look, those bonus features are the best bonus features in the game. I would maybe buy a DVD player just to watch the extended edition bonus features, but I digress.
I shouldn't laugh. I loved those movies so much, and I'm pretty sure my friend and I watched those bonus features as well ad nauseum.
They're industry standard bonus features.
So you're
okay.
Tolkien scholar.
Tolkien scholar talked about how many of the major atrocities of the 20th century were carried out by bureaucrats, right?
Right. And I mean, that's what's jumping out at me, right? The banality of evil. And I think people who survived World War II,
Mm-hmm.
Le Guin, when was Le Guin born?
She started publishing work in the 60s, I believe.
So she probably missed the war, but she certainly grew up in its aftermath.
She died, she started publishing in the early 60s.
She died in 2018, I know that
She died in 2018 in her 90s.
Good for her.
She was like 93. So she was born in the 30s. So she would have been a kid
Yeah.
during World War II.
Oh, so she was
A kid in California.
a little older than my grandfather, who
Yeah.
is turning 93 next week. Happy birthday, Papa. Yeah, no. Atrocities committed by bureaucrats.
Yeah. So anyway, this tweeter person does have a valid interpretation. I do think, right, and Le Guin talks about very specifically at a few points in essays and things that she doesn't write sermons. She writes fiction. She's not interested in a particular reading or a particular answer, I don't think. And Omelas, actually, its sort of inspiration is very, is both like really deep and kind of playful. May I read the meta text in her little introduction to this story in The Wind's 12 Quarters?
You absolutely may, but you are forbidden from doing it in MFA reading voice.
Fine. All right. So, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, Variations on a Theme by William James. The central idea of this psychomyth, the scapegoat, turns up in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and several people have asked me, rather suspiciously, why I gave the credit to William James. The fact is I haven't been able to reread Dostoevsky, much as I loved him, since I was 25, and I'd simply forgotten he used the idea. But when I met it in James's The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, it was with a shock of recognition. The dilemma of the American conscience can hardly be better stated. Dostoevsky was a great artist and a radical one, but his early social radicalism reversed itself, leaving him a violent reactionary. Whereas the American James, who seems so mild, so naively gentlemanly, look how he says us, assuming all his readers are us as decent as himself, was and remains a genuinely radical thinker. Of course, I didn't read James and sit down and say, now I'll write a story about that lost soul. It seldom works that simply. I sat down and started a story just because I felt like it, with nothing but the word Omelas in mind. It came from a road sign, Salem, Oregon, backwards. Don't you read road signs backwards? Pots, Wools, Nerdlick, Oskenarf, Nas. Salem equals Shlomo equals Salam equals peace. Malas, oh Malas. Omelas, hom halas. Where do you get your ideas from, Miss Le Guin? From forgetting Dostoevsky and reading road signs backwards, naturally. Where else?
She was such a phenomenal and influential thinker, and I have loved everything she's ever written. And yet, the last chunk of that made me, like, I don't know. It just had such, I don't know.
It's just goofy.
Yeah, and like a level of goofy that I, as a person born when I was, raised when I was, it is a level of goofy that I have been unfortunately trained to be deeply suspicious of. Anything that approaches twee, I have like a hackle response that I am actively working on training myself out of because it's not good or healthy.
I think it just goes to show that, like, right, the writers don't necessarily understand how these ideas are working in them and what combination of things. Dostoevsky, serious. William James, serious. Saying road signs backwards is like a goof. And like, oh, but I like the sound of this. Oh, and it has some resonance. Oh, and it, connects in this way. And so there's like this lineage, right? The Dostoevsky, James, Le Guin, and then, of course, all the people that have responded to this story, from all of our tweeters to us doing this podcast to N.K. Jemisin, who wrote an homage/challenge, The Ones Who Stay and Fight.
Yeah. Actually, since you bring it up, let's pick up N.K. Jemisin, because one of the things I did see in response to the main character thread that I just read you was at Rar Mom. I keep seeing this, retweeting the original thread. And at this stage, I'm convinced that this is someone who read N.K. Jemisin's response story, The Ones Who Stay and Fight, first, and decided that the part Jemisin focused on, at the expense of the rest of the original, was all that Omelas contained. And so I know literally nothing about The Ones Who Stay and Fight, and since synopsizing the original took so little time, do you think you could give us a quick breakdown of the response?
Sure. The Ones Who Stay and Fight is... And the reason I call it an homage and challenge is I really think it functions not as I don't think it's a story that's anti-Omelas, so to speak. I think it's very much a yes and we can talk a little bit about what Jemisin says about Le Guin in a Paris Review interview in a little bit. But The Ones Who Stay and Fight is structured almost identically. It is a direct address to a reader. It is talking about a parade in the city of Halat. So not Omelas, but Halat, slight variation. It differs in a few key ways. In one key way, it references America directly, which Omelas does not do. And
interesting.
Yes. And it references Omelas directly.
Well, that makes sense.
This is the paradox of tolerance, the treason of free speech. We hesitate to admit that some people are just f***ing evil and need to be stopped. This is Halat, after all, and not that barbaric America. This is not Omelas, that tick of a city, fat and happy with its head buried in a tortured child. My accounting of Halat is an homage, true, but there's nothing for you to fear, friend. And then it goes on to talk about how ideas from our universe, specifically bigoted ideas, will filter in to Halat. And there are people called social workers who root these ideas out, sometimes murder people who are spreading them to protect the thing from continuing to go. And if children are exposed to the ideas, they're taken into a re-education program and taught to be social workers in turn. And so there is this real intense, but it also has that same kind of like, well, do you believe in this now that there's this like super harsh enforcement in this beautiful city where there's real equality? Because we are stamping out this idea come hell or high water. And there is a cost to that. And that cost is some kinds of thinking are not acceptable. And we may need to use violence to eradicate them. And so like there's some realism in it. It's another ambiguous utopia, right? And so, but no one's leaving Halat. They're sort of bringing people in. But it's another really complicated story, and it exists side by side with Omelas. I teach these two together sometimes, and students get really worked up about Jemisin like criticizing Le Guin. And I think Jemisin was inspired in like that way that is the most exciting part about reading, right? You read a thing and you're like, oh my God, I have an idea. This makes me think of something that I can do. I'm responding to this. This is like genuine inspiration. And so that now, like that lineage now continues. And
sure. I think for people out there who are not book gremlins, and especially for people out there who maybe had not great experiences with like English classes and stuff, I feel like we do a bad job sometimes of conveying the extent to which works of fiction are frequently in conversation with one another. And I think that's...
Amen.
I guess what I'm saying is I think it's a shame that we undersell that, because if you think of fiction as being a long conversation, you don't have to agree with or love every element, every point made in a conversation to understand it. Much like if you think of fiction broadly as watching two of your friends get increasingly worked up in an argument that maybe doesn't actually mean anything or have a clear ending point, you know that sometimes, depending on what day it is and how many beers have been consumed and what kind of a mood your one friend is in, sometimes he's going to say some wild shit. And he might even realize that he said some wild shit and back down after a minute. Similarly, your other friend might be, I don't know, underslept, too sober, if such a thing exists, and make a really lame point. But they're all points in a conversation. Mm-hmm. And you know what? I let that metaphor go on too long.
It's all right. And I mean, but it is. It's the way, I think it's like the way a culture talks about itself and to itself. And that's what, like, I mean, we look at past works of art and they seem dated, and understandably so, right? They are products of their time, and they have the vocabularies of their time, and they have the flaws of the thinking of that time, and all those things are true. Those are also the things sometimes helped us get to this point. And so it is a conversation. It's a building. It's a yes and, I think, generally speaking. And yeah, it just always, one of the reasons I like teaching these two together is to try to kind of pry that apart a little bit. Like, Jemison was a fan.
Yeah.
Now, she has different ideas about what, like, this story, Omelas, made her think different things. And so she wrote her own story. Isn't that how it's supposed to work? Isn't that, like, why we read? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that people just love a good literary beef and will spin them up if they need to. But I think Omelas is a fascinating entry into the conversation. I can also see how, from the perspective, I mean, I don't know exactly when Jemison wrote the response, but I can say that from the year of our Satan 2023, it does feel, it's hard not to find it a little naive. You know what I mean? Like, I know I kind of said this earlier, but it feels a little bit like these ethics questions, these trolley problems writ large, are pointless because we're living in them. And the answer is we do nothing. The answer is we do nothing over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And are these kinds of things the best way to get people moving in a different direction?
If we can we?
Yeah, I don't know.
I want to be clear. Didn't Read It, the podcast, is not here to answer those questions. We are here to answer questions about books. But sometimes we're going to wander into the big shit. And then we're going to back away slowly with our hands in the air.
Yeah, I mean, look, books are full of big shit. But books are how we haltingly make sense of, process the big shit. And, you know,
it's reading rainbow.
That's right.
So, Ty,
mm-hmm.
and we have time if we want to do some more meandering, but is there anything you really deeply wanted to touch on that you have not yet ticked the box of?
No, other than I think reading lots of Le Guin is a great idea, and reading lots of Jemison is a great idea. They are two of my favorite writers, full stop, let alone in the speculative realm. And stories are complicated. And probably if you think a story means one thing, you are looking at it a little narrowly. And that's fine. It can mean one thing to you, but don't expect it to mean the same thing to everybody else.
Fiction is deeply subjective, and
mm-hmm.
that's one of the best things about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that I would sort of, for our last section here, I would read you some other Omelas posts.
Oh, I'd love that. Great.
Just a couple. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
City of Omelas, 4.9 out of 5 stars, parentheses, based on 3,500 ratings. 1,200 positive reviews. 1 negative review, parentheses, hidden by moderator.
Oh my God. That's great.
Thanks to @ZuzaReal.
That's great.
All right. This one from @Rag and Bone Shop. Defund the child basement, crowed the far left all summer. Now, in several important Omelas area special elections, ordinary Omelans are going to the polls to say this idea is far too radical for them. Did the liberals go too far? President Biden has never supported the defunding of the child basement, the White House press secretary clarified. In fact, he is proud of several endorsements from child basement security unions.
Oh, those suburban Omelas moderates.
From @growing_Daniel. Reporter. Hello, I'm from the New York Times. I'm calling about a feature we're writing about your town. Mayor of Omelas. Huge sigh. This is about the kid, isn't it? And this is one of my... I love the ways in which Twitter is sometimes shockingly archaic in its absolute joy and riffing on some very, very old school jokes, such as the following from @ZHandlin. Child goes to the doctor, says his suffering is unbearable, says all of the world's miseries are on his head. Doctor says, you should go to Omelas. Remarkable place. It's the festival of summer, and almost everyone there lives in joy and peace. But doctor, the child says.
Oh, yeah. Those are excellent. And I think, right, like, I don't know, it's the spirit of play. Like, it's funny, and you know, like Omelas is not funny, but there's some like sarcastic stuff in there. There's the tone is kind of works in that way in certain moments, and so there's a lot going on in there, and those are very funny.
Yeah, Le Guin was very good at folding things into her work that were not quite, you know, she had a good kind of dark, very dry sense of humor.
Yeah, and I think she took herself with a reasonable amount of seriousness. A lot of her writing about her work is like, oh, you know, when I wrote this book, you know, these are all the problems with it that I see now, and you know, but also, oh well, you know, I needed to write that book in order to learn those things, and so what are you going to do? You can't be perfect all the time.
Le Guin said, shit happens. Sometimes you're Omelas, sometimes you're the kid.
Ooh.
Also, I want to share that someone retweeted the person who accidentally became the main character with their strong Omelas opinions and said, they're beating your ass so hard in the quote retweets, you are now the degraded child sustaining the prosperity of Omelas.
And thus, you know, the cycle perpetuates.
Oh my God, Twitter is Omelas.
Twitter really is Omelas.
Twitter runs on the suffering of the main character of the day.
It does, yes.
It's the only thing keeping it going.
Yep. There
are no servers. Just bean dads as far as the eye can see.
Oh my God.
Do you remember Bean Dad? We were so innocent then.
I'm not sure I do.
You missed. Yeah, I refuse. This is just going to turn into a Twitter podcast.
That's fine. Yeah, no, we don't need to educate me on all of.
We don't need to
Twitter
bring back
history.
Bean Dad.
Yeah, I'll investigate Bean Dad on my own. We won't subject your listeners to that.
So, for people who are interested in some contemporary lit with maybe similar vibes, what would you recommend, Ty?
Well, I would recommend Jemison's collection, How Long Till Black Future Month, which is her short story collection. And I would recommend her series, The Broken Earth trilogy, which is some of the best fantasy writing I have ever read. Nenende Okorafor, who wrote Binti and several other pieces of science fiction and fantasy, has some really wonderful stuff and some novella-length things that are pretty interesting and nice quick reads too. And then I just started a short story collection by a debut author named Allegra Hyde called The Last Catastrophe, and it's a mix of sort of speculative fiction but also lots of stuff focused on, you know, climate crisis, but it is not despairing and it is not like naive. And so it's walking, I think, a pretty delicate line, and I'm impressed with it so far.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And for my part, if you want to lean into a little bit of despair, because sometimes it's cathartic, just because you mentioned climate crisis, and I think this is on similar vibes, is Lydia Millett's A Children's Bible, which is a quick little novel also about climate crisis, and is a rollicking, almost unrelentingly bleak, but I really enjoyed it. Ty, thank you so much for being here with me today.
It was my pleasure, Grace. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for telling me all about Omelas, giving me some good context. You realize that I'm never going to stop sending you tweets about Omelas.
Great. Keep them coming.
Just like I'm never going to stop sending you screen caps of the things that Joyce Carol Oates posts.
That's all that. Look, all that's need to know. I get it.
Hey, a trans rights queen, Joyce Carol Oates.
Right.
Thank God.
Yeah. Dodged a bullet on that one.
Honestly, she can be as angry about Halloween decorations as she wants, as long as she stays firmly on the trans rights. That's good.
We don't need more J.K. Rowling, Alice Walker situations.
Correct. Oh my God. Jesus. Yeah. Anyway, Ty, if people want to find more of you, where should they go? Is there anything you want to plug here?
Well, you can check out, I have a website. It's typhelps.com. Very fancy domain name. And you can find some links to a little bit of the writing I've published, book reviews, short stories, poetry, and there's some music linked there as well. And you can contact me through that website if you must. But thank you for listening, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us this week. I very much appreciate having you here to talk about Ursula K. Le Guin and Omelas. And if you can, this week, this month, this pay period, consider supporting a living author, because they could really use it. Bye. Didn't Read It was created, written, and edited by me, Grace Todd. Kaylee Hughes is our publicist and producer. You can follow the podcast on Twitter or Instagram at didn'treaditpod, or reach us via email at didn'treaditpod@gmail.com. For source notes and further reading, as well as a list of all existing episodes, please visit our website at didn'treaditpod.com. We are recorded in Richmond, Virginia, with special thanks to Black Iris Social Club and Pesca Trio Publishing. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a review or rating on your preferred podcasting platform, or just tell a friend. If you did not enjoy today's episode, we are currently accepting applications for a full-time nemesis. Our intro music is Books, written, performed, and recorded by William Albritton.
Our closing music for this episode is Tinta Verde, composed by Augustin Bardi, who was described as a frustrated idealist and rigorous critic of his own work. Aren't we all? Recording courtesy of museopen.org.